This is Miami, an American city where 70% of residents identify as Hispanic. More than half were born outside the country, and 1.8 million people speak Spanish at home. It's the only major city in the US where you can show up speaking zero English and not just get by, but truly flourish. Business is done in Spanish. Local elections are run in Spanish. US foreign policy toward Latin America is essentially a Miami issue. And the wild part is, all of this happened in the span of a single lifetime. Meanwhile, Los Angeles, which technically has more Hispanic people, or El Paso, which is closest to the border of Mexico, can't compare to that Latin feeling of Miami. So how did this city become referred to as the, quote, capital of Latin America? Well, before any of the history, you have to look at where Miami actually sits. It's at the southeastern tip of the Florida Peninsula, closer to Havana than it is to Florida's own state capital in Tallahassee. Its latitude lines up less with the rest of the United States than with Cuba and the Bahamas, placing Miami directly at the gateway between North America and the Caribbean. The geographic link was apparent from the start, and the city that rose on that bay was always going to be the staging ground for whatever happened next. But for a long time, nothing really did. Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon landed in Florida in 1513, and Spain held the colony for roughly 3 centuries before ceding it to the United States in 1821. But here's the weird part. Despite all those years of Spanish colonial rule, almost no permanent Hispanic population base carried over. The seeding of Hispanic Miami didn't really start until the late 1880s, when Bahamian, Puerto Rican, and Dominican sugar workers arrived through West Indies trade, followed by Cubans drawn to Florida's growing cigar industry. The base was tiny, but it mattered, because immigrants settle where their language and community already exist, and Miami had just enough of one to matter later. For most of the first half of the 20th century, Miami wasn't anything out of the ordinary. By 1950, its total population was about 467,000, and only around 11% were foreign-born. Of those, only 12% came from Latin America and the Caribbean. The city was primarily just absorbing New Yorkers, Midwesterners, and Southerners drawn by climate. Miami was a sleepy southern tourist town, and it possibly would have stayed that way if not for a man 228 miles south. On January 1st, 1959, Fidel Castro's rebel group took Havana, and dictator Batista fled the country that same day. The Cuban Revolution didn't just change Cuba, it changed Miami. What followed was unlike any previous Hispanic migration to the United States. From 1959 to 1962, what came to be called the Golden Exile sent roughly 250,000 Cubans across the Florida Strait. These weren't poor migrants chasing opportunity. They were Cuba's middle and upper class, Catholic, educated, and largely from Havana, which contributed more than half of all Cuban immigrants in that period. Many were professionals tied to American companies that had just been nationalized. Cuba before 1959 had one of the highest standards of living and largest middle class of any Latin American state. So when these people fled, they fled with skills, education, and in many cases, business assets they managed to transport directly from Havana to Miami. Now, you'd think the US wouldn't just hand them all green cards. Haitians fleeing the Duvalier dictatorship in the exact same era were classified as economic migrants and forcibly returned. But that's exactly what happened. In 1966, Congress passed the Cuban Adjustment Act, granting Cubans a privileged status available to no other Latino group, automatic permanent residency after just 1 year on US soil, plus extensive refugee assistance and generous federal small business loans. The refugees thought their stay would be temporary though, since the April 1961 Bay of Pigs invasion, a CIA-backed attempt by Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro was supposed to take him down, but it failed, and the refugees realized they weren't going home. So they did what people do when they realize they're staying. They built. Republic National Bank and Cuban banker Luis Botifoy started handing out what they called character loans, letting Cubans who had nothing start small businesses on essentially a handshake. From 1965 to 1973 came the Freedom Flights, twice daily flights between Cuba and Miami that brought 270,000 more Cubans. By the time Castro shut them down to stop the brain drain, Miami had grown to include roughly 450,000 Cubans. up from around 100,000 before the revolution. The Cuban economy had been deteriorating throughout the 1970s, and finally, in April 1980, over 10,000 Cubans crowded onto the grounds of the Peruvian embassy in Havana asking for asylum. Castro, in a move that surprised even his own government, announced that anyone who wanted to leave could go. In the span of 6 months, around 125,000 Cubans packed into 1,700 boats and reached South Florida in what became known as the Mariel Boat Lift. The US tried to deter them through Guantanamo repatriation and diplomatic pressure, but once they hit American soil, asylum law obligated processing. Half of them settled permanently in Miami, increasing the city's labor force by 7% and the Cuban worker count by 20%. By the 1980 census, Miami-Dade country was 35.7% Hispanic, and 70% of them were Cuban. But here's the thing. 1980 was also arguably the worst single year in Miami's history. The Mariel boat lift, the cocaine wars, and the McDuffie race riots all hit at once. At least 20,000 of the refugees had spent time in Cuban prisons, with Castro framing the boat lift as social cleansing. Existing white residents in the city sometimes felt threatened by the new arrivals, with some choosing to leave Florida, while county commissions passed laws declaring that most government businesses must be done in English, although this was later repealed in 1993. Speaking of the cocaine wars, by the early 1980s, the Drug Enforcement Administration was measuring the South Florida drug trade at $12 billion a year, making it the single largest sector of the local economy. Miami was supplying roughly 70% of the cocaine in the United States. The Federal Reserve's Miami branch reported a $5 billion cash surplus in 1979 and 1980, more than all other Federal Reserve banks in the United States combined. It was the cocaine cowboys era, and the city was being remade by Latin America in ways both spectacular and violent, becoming the murder rate capital of the US. Now, while all of this was going on, something quieter and arguably more important was happening at the federal level. See, the wealth fleeing Latin America needed somewhere to land, and Washington was simultaneously trying to make American banks more competitive internationally. In 1978, Congress passed the International Banking Act, which established the first federal regulatory framework for foreign banks in the United States. By June 1980, Miami's foreign banking institutions numbered 17, including Banco do Brasil, Banco de la Nación Argentina, and Banco de Bogotá, among others. The legal infrastructure was being built to hold Latin American money on American soil, and the money was coming. From 1973 to 1987, capital flight from Latin America totaled around $151 billion, roughly 43% of the total external debt Latin American countries acquired in that period. Much of it found its way into Miami. Since one Latin American nation or another always seemed to be in political crisis, the money kept flowing in. And there was indeed always a crisis. Outstanding Latin American debts jumped from $29 billion at the end of 1970 to $159 billion by the end of 1978, and reached $327 billion by 1982. That same year, Mexico informed the Federal Reserve that it could no longer service its $80 billion debt. 16 Latin American countries ultimately rescheduled their debts. Each crisis accelerated capital flight to Miami. Transactions with the Caribbean Basin and Latin America regularly made up 80 to 90% of the city's commercial bank activity with foreigners. By the 1990s, Miami had more international bank offices than any US city except New York. Brickell, the financial district just south of downtown, earned the nickname the Wall Street of the South. But what about other Latino groups, though? Because by the time the financial architecture was in place, the political shocks rippling across the hemisphere were pushing one nationality after another toward an already Spanish-speaking, increasingly Latin banking Miami. Nicaraguans fled the Civil War through the 1980s, and like the Cubans, they were disproportionately professional and asset-bearing. Salvadorans and Guatemalans followed as Central America's civil wars escalated. Colombians arrived heavily in the early 1990s as cartel violence, kidnapping of the professional class, and paramilitary attacks peaked. Even after Colombia stabilized in the mid-2000s, most of them stayed, and family reunification kept the flow going. Peruvians arrived fleeing the Shining Path Maoist insurgency and hyperinflation. Argentinians came for stability after their currency crises. Hondurans arrived on a different track. Their earlier migrations through the 1970s and 1980s were primarily economic rather than wealthy professional flight. The defining moment came in October 1998, when Hurricane Mitch killed 7,000 Hondurans and displaced over 1.5 million people. The US granted temporary protected status, and the result was a largely working-class community concentrated in North Miami. By 1990, there were roughly 400,000 Central Americans in Florida, and by 2000, Miami had become majority Hispanic. By 2010, non-Cuban Hispanics actually outnumbered Cubans for the first time. But it wasn't only Spanish you heard on the streets. Miami became home to one of the largest Brazilian populations outside Brazil, with the Brazilian Foreign Ministry estimating around 300,000 Portuguese speakers in the metro area, concentrated in oceanfront enclaves like Sunny Isles Beach and Aventura. We can't forget the Caribbean groups either. The metro area has the largest Haitian community in the United States, with over 300,000 of Haitian descent in Miami-Dade alone. Yet there's one more piece of infrastructure that locked all of this in place though: the airport. See, Miami International Airport became American Airlines' primary Latin America gateway, and per the Miami-Dade Aviation Department, roughly 82% of all